King Benjamin worked his entire life to teach the gospel to his people and then help them come into covenant with God, both at an individual level, but also at a national level as a kingdom, as the Nephite nation. And King Benjamin says he wants to give them a new name, an identity that is going to set them apart because of this covenant. The concept of a people coming together and making covenants is definitely biblical and scriptural, but it was also a very central concept and a driving force and belief among many of the early colonists and the Puritans and the Pilgrims and the Reformers. In fact, this concept of creating churches through covenant, entering into covenants with God, even though they did not have the restoration yet or the ordinances, was a key belief among the Reformation. And today we're going to talk about a specific group during the Reformation and the early colonization of America who identified themselves actually by the name of Covenanters. So who are the Scottish Covenanters? The Scottish Covenanter movement existed during the 1600s in Scotland. As some historical backdrop, what led to this? Before this time, we had the Reformation martyrs that we talked about in Lesson 2. We had William Tyndale translating the Bible and bringing it into the language of the common people. This is around the time, but also shortly after, the time of the separatist pilgrims, after they leave England and they come to America. All the way up in Scotland, they were experiencing their own Reformation. And for some reason, the people in Scotland really gravitated to this concept of Covenanters so much that their entire movement became identified as a covenant people. The monarchs or kings at this time were King James and then Charles I. And they were complete tyrants. Not only did they strip away political freedom from their people and maintain a very tyrannical grasp over the more secular side of the government, but they also believed that they had this divine right to rule the church. And the problem with that is that their view of how the church was supposed to function, what the people could believe inside the church, was very much at odds with the Bible and with the teachings that so many of these faithful forefathers across Europe were coming to understand and be converted to as they were reading the Bible. But really, it came down to the issue of control. And of course, when that came to the ecclesiastical side, that was something that the people revolted against. In 1638, thousands of men gathered in Greyfriars Kirk in Edinburgh, Scotland, and in other churches across Scotland to sign the National Covenant. It was called the National Covenant. And in this covenant, they swore to God that they would resist the king, that they would stand for liberty, that they would reform the culture of their time, and that they acknowledged Jesus Christ as the king over the kirk, their word for church. Signing this covenant was essentially treason against the king, and every man who signed it was basically signing a death warrant and putting his life on the line. You can think of this as similar to the signers of the Declaration of Independence signing that document, sending it to the king and saying, you do not have this authority, you do not have this jurisdiction. And in this case, in 1638 in Scotland, these men were coming together and saying, before God, we swear we are going to defend Jesus Christ's right to rule the church. We answer to him, and we are all going to unite together to stand for religious freedom in our nation. And for a time, they had freedom. For a time, they actually began through these covenants and by uniting the people together to make reforms, to make changes. The English Civil War that was launched by Cromwell and others down in England really helped them because in England, the Puritans were having the same problems with the king down there. And so the Scottish Covenanters were able to have a short period of peace as they began really this revival across the nation. But then King Charles I's son, King Charles II, was restored to the throne. We're just going very quickly over the history here because we don't have time to go into all the different political details. But essentially, his father, Charles I, was beheaded after the English Civil War for breaking the laws of liberty and freedom in England and treason against the people. But his son escaped and later came back. And he said, you know what, if you put me back in as king, I will sign this national covenant. You can have freedom. I will be the king. I will protect you. Let's just put this nation back together. And they bought it, but it was a trap. And Charles II went back on his word and immediately began imprisoning and killing the very men that he had promised they would be safe with this new national covenant. He immediately started repealing all of the laws that the Scottish Covenanters had put in, and Scotland very quickly came under intense persecution. There was this oath that was instituted called the Oath of Abjuration that essentially claimed that every person needed to swear that they would reject the covenants, they would reject the national covenant, reject these other covenants, and that they would not fight the king, that they would not resist him. They swore an oath of loyalty. And it was instituted across the nation that any soldier at any time could ask anyone. He could just be riding down the street or riding through a glen, and if he came across a man, woman, or child, he could immediately ask them, swear this oath. And if they did not, they had the right to kill them on the spot, imprison them. And so immediately the country went into a dark time. It's become known now as the killing times, a time of violence, a time of war, as many of the men stood up and began saying, we have to fight for our liberty. We can't live under this. And it was a very bloody and desperate and dark time in Scotland as these men, women, and even children many times began rallying to fight for these covenants and fight for the right to make these covenants with God. John Howie, in his book, The Scots Worthies, which tells the stories of so many of these Scottish Covenanters, he estimates that approximately about 18,000 people were persecuted or killed in about 28 years. One of these was a young woman named Margaret Wilson. Margaret Wilson was only 18 years old, and she joined the Covenanters. She read the truth, she was reading the Bible, and she said, you know what, I do not side with this mainstream state-run church. I side with these covenants, and she joined them. She had a 15-year-old brother and a 13-year-old sister who both said, yes, Margaret, we agree with you. We are not going to abdicate these covenants. And so they had to go into hiding. They couldn't live at home. It was too dangerous. And so they went into hiding in the hills, and they suffered cold and hunger and danger trying to survive up there for months at a time without seeing their parents or being able to visit their loved ones. And there was a day when Margaret and Agnes snuck out to try to see their father. They had heard that their father was going to be visiting this neighboring village. They had not seen him for a long time. They really missed him. And so they snuck down out of their hiding place to be able to try to see him. Well, they got caught, and their father frantically tried to raise money to be able to ransom them, to save their lives. But unfortunately, he was only able to raise enough for Agnes, the 13-year-old, and he couldn't raise enough to save Margaret in time. So Margaret was sentenced to death by drowning. There was another Margaret in the prison at the same time for the same reason, this holding to these covenants with God that they had made as a people. She was an elderly woman, but she was also sentenced to be drowned at the same time. So they took these two women down to the shoreline. They tied them to these stakes that were planted out so that when the tide came in, as the water levels rose, they would eventually be submerged and die from drowning. And they put the elderly woman out further into the ocean so that she would die first, so that the 18-year-old Margaret would see her dying, gasping for breath, and hopefully that would scare her into recanting and giving them the oath that they wanted against the covenants. Margaret watches her friend pass away and die, and the water comes to her, and she begins struggling for breath as the water covers her. But before she could drown, one of the soldiers rowed out and pulled her up out of the water, lifted her head out, and said, okay, you've almost died here. Are you willing to recant and give us what we want to hear? And she said, no. She said, I will not. I am one of Christ's children. Let me go. And the history is told that she sang hymns and psalms until she gave her life for this covenanting cause. She was only 18 years old, but actually many of the Covenanter martyrs and people involved in this cause were actually very young. It was characterized, a movement, really by a lot of young mothers, young fathers, teenagers, young men in their 20s who were just inspired by this feeling that they not only wanted to believe in the Bible, they not only wanted to have access to the scriptures, but they needed the right to make covenants with God as a nation so that they could reform their nation to be like ancient Israel in the Bible. That was really their inspiration. They noticed, they read the Bible and they said, you know what? Under Moses' day, ancient Israel made covenants with God. They said, we are God's people. We're going to live a certain way. We're going to be different from the world. And they wanted to do the same thing in Scotland. And there is another story of these men who were taken prisoner after a battle, a fierce battle that unfortunately the Covenanters lost. It was called the Battle of Bothwell Brigg, in one of these skirmishes fighting for liberty. There were 1,200 soldiers taken captive, and they were imprisoned, and a number of them died from disease, from starvation, or they recanted and said, okay, this is too hard, and they gave up, and there were about 250 of these prisoners left, these Covenanter soldiers who had been taken a prisoner. And so what did the government decide to do with these men, these righteous fathers, these Covenanter soldiers? They actually sold them into slavery, put them on a ship to be sent to the Americas to work as slaves on the English plantations. These men were boarded on a ship and they were confined down in the hull because a storm came up. And so they were nailed down, tied down in the hull of this ship so that they could not escape if the ship was shipwrecked. 47 luckily did escape because a crew member risked his life to start breaking up the deck with an axe so that some of them could get out. The rest drowned. 47 survived of this shipwreck, and they were immediately rounded up and shipped to Jamaica or to New Jersey, actually as slaves. This is definitely a side of history that not a lot of people talk about, that it wasn't just Africans that were sold as slaves, but actually righteous fathers who were fighting for liberty in Europe, who were part of the Reformation movement. Some of them were actually sold into slavery by the government that was trying to eradicate and persecute them. Another compelling Scottish Covenanter martyr was James Renwick. He was only 26 years old when he gave his life as a martyr for the Covenanter cause. But his story is really beautiful. He was the only one of his siblings who survived infancy. All the rest of his siblings died. But from a very young age, he just felt drawn to religion. At 6 years old, he was reading the Bible, and his parents and those around him noticed there is something peculiar about this child. He worked hard to pay his own way through the University of Edinburgh, but he couldn't graduate. They wouldn't let him graduate because he refused to swear that oath of allegiance to the king and to renounce the covenants. Well, after he watched another Scottish Covenanter be killed for his faith, he decided, I need to join this movement and I need to get involved. I need to take a stand. And so he began, this is in his early 20s, preaching in what were called conventicles. Because the Scottish churches, the main churches and the buildings and the clergy were all completely run by the government and run by these apostate religious practices and teachings that were being introduced by the king, all of those that were of the reformer mindset that wanted religious freedom and were like, no, we want the pure teachings of the Bible, they had to meet in secret. And they would call these secret meetings, they were called conventicles. They'd meet in fields, in barns, in forests, wherever they could hide from the roving troops of dragoons and these soldiers that were roaming through the hillside trying to break up, imprison, or capture these lawbreakers. And so James Renwick, he begins preaching at these conventicles, and he became known as a fiery preacher. He's only in his early 20s here, but they said he had fiery passion, and he would go and he would help families by baptizing the children. Of course, they didn't have the ordinances, but they were trying the best that they could according to the knowledge that they had, and the main churches would not baptize any of the children of these Covenanter families, or the families didn't agree with these, apostate church practices. And so James Renwick would, again, illegally travel throughout Scotland to visit these families and baptize their children and preach to them and encourage them. He became a little bit more bold when he publicly published a statement saying, the king is a tyrant. We need to have armed resistance against these attacks, against these people that are persecuting us and putting our lives in danger. We need to fight for our freedom. We need to defend ourselves. And then he published yet another statement, a similar statement. And so that put his name on the wanted list. And the government began searching to have him captured and put to death. So he went into hiding for 3 years, but that didn't stop him. Even though he was in hiding, he continued preaching at hundreds and hundreds of conventicles. But unfortunately, his health couldn't keep up. He was living outdoors. He was living in the cold, horrible conditions. And so his health was completely broken. And in the midst of this, he was caught at 26 years old. And they tried to get him to recant. They said, if you do not recant, we will kill you. And he said, I will not recant. I will not give up these covenants. I will not give up my faith. And so he was hung. And then they cut off his head and they cut off his hands. And they hung them up on the gate, on the city gates, so that everyone could see what happens to someone who resists, who fights against the government. Again, this was a young man who fought for freedom and fought for faith for years, and he was only in his early 20s. He's 26 when he dies, after living a life of years of service, a life in hiding, trying to preach the gospel. Why? Because he, like so many others, they believed in these covenants, they believed in God, and they were willing to put their lives on the line to change society and help restore God's truth. This is what is so beautiful about the Scottish Covenanter movement. What motivated them to put their lives on the line? What motivated them to risk everything? It wasn't fighting for less taxes. It wasn't land grabs. It was covenants, because they read in the Bible and they said, ancient Israel made covenants with God, and we want to be like Israel. James Kerr, when writing on the Scottish Covenanters in the 1800s, wrote, quote, "More than any other nation of modern times, the people of the British Isles resemble in their covenant actings the people of Israel, and Scotland is the likest to Judah. Certainly, Scotland's covenants with God were coronets on Scotland's brow." End quote. Now, this author was not a Latter-day Saint, but I love how he pulls out Scotland's tie to Judah. Of course, he's referring to their motivations, their way of thinking, this feeling that they had being drawn to covenants. But we've talked about this in previous lessons, and you could talk about it for hours, but all of the evidence for the tribe of Judah, as well as Joseph, in the British Isles, and especially in Scotland. You literally have the lion of the tribe of Judah right on the royal crests and in the buildings and on the castles when you travel to Scotland. You see the symbols all over. And again, it's this concept of covenants that was so important to them. And it wasn't just that 1638 national covenant, but also others. There was a covenant in 1556 where many of them covenanted to refuse all society with idolatry. And then the next year in Edinburgh, there was another covenant where they said, quote, "We by his grace shall with all diligence continually apply our whole power, our substance, and our very lives to maintain, set forward, and establish the most blessed word of God." End quote. Does that sound a little bit like the law of consecration and other covenants we learn about in the restored gospel? I think it does. There was another covenant in 1559 that read, quote, "To put away all things that dishonor his name, that God may be truly and purely worshipped." And then the next year, yet another covenant in Edinburgh, quote, "To procure by all means possible that the truth of God's word may have free passage within this realm," end quote. The Scottish Covenanters had this sense that beyond just teaching and reading and studying the scriptures, there comes a point where you need to make a covenant with God, a covenant to follow him, a covenant to unite together to build the kingdom of God and further his purposes. We see the same in the Book of Mormon with King Benjamin. King Benjamin spends his entire life teaching his people the gospel. When he gets up on the tower to teach them and ask them to make this covenant with God, he tells them, he says, "All of you know who God is. All of you know the gospel. I have taught you well. But now it's time to make a covenant." That same process, that same way of thinking was had in Scotland during the 15 and 1600s. So there was a national covenant that was signed in 1580. And a few decades later, in the 1630s, is when King Charles I really started clamping down, really trying to reinstate his authority and his power and his control over the church in Scotland. This led to riots, especially when the king tried to introduce the Book of Common Prayer into the churches. This was in 1637. There is a legendary story told about this one old lady in one of the churches where the minister got up and began reading out of the Book of Common Prayer, and she got so angry she picked up her stool and she flung it at him. And that sparked an entire riot and others throughout the city and throughout the country. But the king was very direct. He said, "I will excommunicate you if you do not acknowledge the king over all the church." And this is what led to kind of the official, the big, the most recognized covenant in the Scottish Covenanter movement, which I mentioned before, the 1638 National Covenant. So the question then became, what do we do? How do we handle this problem? If the king is coming in and he's taking away our liberty, if he's taking away our right to worship God as we choose, how do we fight back? Do we take up arms? Do we organize a resistance? Do we protest? And what the Scottish people decided to do was that the solution was to come together as a people, to make a covenant with God, and to stand by those covenants. It was covenant-oriented. James Kerr expounds on this when he's writing about the Scottish Covenanters, when he says, quote, "Could an oppressed people bear the tyranny longer? But will they take up arms and scatter carnage and blood throughout the land? No. Their weapons will not be carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. They will go to the covenant God of the kingdom, and they will stand before him saying, 'Thine are we, David, and on thy side, thou son of Jesse. Scotland will renew her covenant with God, end quote. And so the national covenant that had been signed in 1580 was revised, and it was brought to Greyfriars Kirk in 1638, the church there in Edinburgh, Scotland. And men gathered to take a look at this covenant and come together again and to sign it. Remember again that this was illegal. This was very similar to the Declaration of Independence. Signing this document was tantamount to signing your death warrant. And these men were not from the lower class of society. They weren't the poor. They weren't the farmers. Most of these men were the lords. They were the wealthy. They were the highly educated. They were the influential leaders of society. And so they gather together. They come to Greyfriars Kirk. And it was a memorable place to gather because this is where many of their ancestors were buried. And they're standing there in the yard there, looking across all of these tombs, really, of their forefathers, looking at them in a sense. And this covenant was read to them. James Kerr describes what happened next. He says, quote, "When he had finished reading the covenant, reading the document, all was still as the grave. But the silence was soon broken. An aged man of noble air was seen advancing. He came forward slowly, and deep emotion was visible in his venerable features. He took up the pen with a trembling hand and signed the document. Then a general movement now took place. All the Presbyterians in the church pressed forward to the covenant and subscribed their names. But this was not enough. A whole nation was waiting," end quote. Alexander Henderson, commenting on this day, said, quote, "This was the day of the Lord's power, in which multitudes offered themselves most willingly, like dewdrops of the morning. This was indeed the great day of Israel, wherein the arm of the Lord was revealed, the day of the Redeemer's strength, on which the princes of the people assembled to swear their allegiance to the King of Kings," end quote. Do you notice what is different about this movement than so many other movements in history, so many other liberty movements, even the way that so many conservatives and traditionalists approach fighting for freedom today? These were men who recognized that if they were going to succeed, if they were going to turn their country around, the only way to do it was to come together, to make a covenant with God, to be bound by that covenant, and to stand by it so that God could bless them like he blessed ancient Israel. And that unity produced power. The king, as he began watching this movement that was taking off in Scotland, he said, "I have no more power in Scotland than a dog of Venice," end quote. The king realized that that unity and that power of turning to God caused him as a tyrant to lose power. He had armies. He had the throne. He was the monarch. And yet he felt powerless in front of all of these men who were coming together, united under covenant with God. And I want to ask a question as you're hearing these stories and you're learning about this movement. If that was the power that was produced in the 1600s in Scotland, long before the Restoration, long before they had the Book of Mormon, what could be the power if a movement like that took place again? It's something to think about. So because of these national covenants that were taking place, and specifically the national covenant, the king actually gave in. And they called a general assembly. It was the first free assembly of the church in 42 years. The Lord intervened really to help the Scottish people because King Charles I became very distracted and busy and occupied in England as the Puritans were fighting for liberty there. This was the English Civil War with Cromwell, and the Puritans were fighting for liberty there. So it kind of gave the Scots a bit of freedom to be able to begin pushing reform and religious freedom with these covenants up in Scotland. And then eventually England and Scotland united and they signed another covenant called the Solemn League and Covenant. They said with uplifted hands, they took this oath to God. King Charles I was kicked out, and as James Kerr describes it, quote, their inward piety made them men of power and enabled them to bear down every barrier to the kingdom of their Lord, erected by the craft of prince and priest. Again, what gave these men power to fight for freedom, both in the church, to save the church, to preserve true doctrine, and at the same time preserve liberty in their nation? These covenants. It was said that, quote, there were more souls converted to Christ in that short time than in any other season since the Reformation. Their intense piety prepared them for the persecutions to follow and for the crowns of martyrdom, end quote. It was making these covenants with God that inspired and gave these men the courage to defy tyranny, to change laws. Because this was not just a religious movement, as I've mentioned before, it had political and freedom implications as well. Quote, there are two powers ordained of God and both must be reformed, they believed. The comprehensive aims of the Covenanters embraced both state and church. For there, by an army without sword or spear, the absolutism of monarchies and the tyranny of hierarchies were scattered like chaff before the wind. End quote. So you might be asking yourself, wait, what happened to this movement? This sounds amazing. What happened to them? Well, God had a bigger picture than they did. I'm sure many of them, as King Charles II began moving in with troops and they went through the killing times and so many of those sacrifices that I described earlier, I'm sure many of the Scottish Covenanters began wondering, what is God's plan? What is God doing? Why are we being abandoned? But God had a bigger plan, because do you know what that persecution did? That persecution pushed many of those Scottish Covenanters to flee Scotland and come to America. God looked at them and he saw, here is a people prepared for more light, for more truth. Persecution brought them to America, brought them to the promised land, where they were able to finally achieve liberty and pave the way so that less than 200 years later, Joseph Smith came on the scene and was able to restore the gospel, bring forth the Book of Mormon, and history was never the same again. The best blood in Scotland was driven out, and then sadly the movement did die in Scotland. But it lived on in America. God had a plan there. It was very intentional. The impact of the Scots and the Scottish Covenanters on America and the early founding of America cannot be underestimated. It's estimated that between 1763 and 1776, about 50,000 Scots immigrated to America. Half of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were of Scottish descent. Over 30 of the presidents of the United States have also had Scottish blood. And a lot of people have actually looked and studied the National Covenant and then looked at the preamble to the Constitution, and they believe there are parallels. They believe that the National Covenant, the wording there, actually influenced the preamble to the Constitution of the United States, which is a possibility since so many of the founding fathers were actually mentored by men who came from the Scottish Covenanter movement. You have James Madison, who was Scotch-Irish himself, and he studied under the Scottish Reverend Donald Robertson, as well as another Reverend Thomas Martin, who were both Scotch-Irish reverends. You have John Witherspoon. John Witherspoon was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. He was a very influential founding father, and he was actually born in Scotland. He was imprisoned for a time in Scotland, and then he came to America. He became the president of what would become eventually Princeton University, and he ended up mentoring many, many founding fathers, judges, senators, etc. In fact, there was an English politician at the time of the Revolutionary War who said, quote, "There is no use crying about it. Cousin America has run off with a Presbyterian parson, and that is the end of it," end quote. This understanding and this principle that rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God, as was Thomas Jefferson's motto, that was a very strong theme among these Scottish Covenanters. They had it in their blood. So as they were emigrating and coming and being driven to America, they show up And this is about when America heads into the Revolutionary War and they get involved. Many of them fought in the Revolutionary War. In fact, it was the Presbyterian communities that were the most pro-rebel. And just so you know, the Presbyterians were connected with the Scottish Covenanter kind of movement and the way of thinking. And many of those communities in America were noted for being the most pro-rebel in the Revolutionary War. This theme of covenants continued. The name was just changed. Instead of covenants, the more popular term became compact or constitution. So, for example, the Mayflower Compact was really the Mayflower Covenant. They just called it the Compact. Or now when you look at the United States Constitution and you understand that the majority of the delegates to the convention were actually affiliated with covenant-based churches. So they're coming from this perspective. These founding fathers are coming from this perspective of coming together, uniting together, signing covenants under God. And then when you go study the Constitution or you study the Declaration of Independence, you recognize again similar themes. It's this theme of men coming together, signing these covenants with God, and using that to build a new civilization, to bring freedom to their people, and also bring religious freedom as well. And then in somewhat of an ironic twist, some of the American soldiers that were captured by the British during the Revolutionary War were actually shipped back to Edinburgh, Scotland, and imprisoned in the Edinburgh Castle. And there's actually a Prisons of War exhibition, and there is a wooden door there in the exhibition that still has the inscribing of an American flag from one of the American soldiers that was captured, imprisoned there. One of those soldiers took a little penknife and carved a flag into the wooden doors of that prison complex. It's kind of bringing the story home where you have this movement for liberty and freedom starting in Scotland. They come to America, and then as they're driven back and they're imprisoned, it's this feeling of freedom and this dedication to this covenant that they're going to establish and they were willing to give their lives for in America to make the dreams of freedom and hope that they had had for so many years. They wanted to make that a reality, and eventually they did. So we notice this theme of covenants both among the early Nephites as well as in our day. And when you look into the Book of Mormon and when you look into the early signs of the times, it was this focus on covenants and this perspective of making covenants that prepared both groups for greater amounts of freedom and liberty and a greater organization of the church. We're going to see that in the Book of Mormon. King Benjamin's movement of putting the Nephites under covenant eventually leads to them having a greater level of the church established among them. And we're going to see that with the coming forth of the Jaredite record, Mosiah being a seer, and we're going to see that in succeeding lessons. But in both the Book of Mormon and in our day, covenants prepared the people for this greater amount of light and knowledge. Why? Why would covenants be something that's important? Well, Joseph Fielding Smith explains this really well in Doctrines of Salvation, where he explains if you as a person, as an individual, as a family, as a nation, if you want God's favor, if you want to be his people, you have to enter into covenant with him. Joseph Fielding Smith explains, quote, "The gospel covenant is the promise of God to grant to man, through man's obedience and acceptance of the ordinances and principles of the gospel, the glory and exaltation of eternal life. It is the Father in heaven who stipulates the terms of the covenant. Man has no say in the matter or right to alter or annul any provision of the covenant. His duty is to accept on the terms which are presented to him from the Almighty in full faith and obedience, without complaint or desire because of personal weakness to alter or annul what the Father offers for man's salvation. Each ordinance and requirement given to man for the purpose of bringing to pass his salvation and exaltation is a covenant." Okay, that was a big quote. What is Joseph Fielding Smith saying? He's essentially saying all a covenant is God saying, I want to give you a blessing, and here are the terms for receiving that blessing. And if you will comply with those terms, I will be able to bring you into my favor. And ultimately, on the big scale, if you comply with all of the covenants, God says, I will exalt you. I will give you eternal life. You will be able to experience all of the joy that I possess. So every commandment is a covenant. Every ordinance is a covenant. Baptism, keeping the Sabbath day holy, the 10 commandments, the law of tithing, marriage. These are all covenants that Joseph Fielding Smith specifically picks out. So when we look to the Scottish Covenanters, or when we look to the Nephites under King Benjamin, we recognize this same understanding that they both had, that they understood, okay, we want to be in covenant with God because we understand that to have his favor, to be able to be free, to be able to experience true joy and true civilization and harmony and peace, both at an individual level as well as a national level, we have to be in covenant with him. We have to follow the terms and the conditions that he has set. This concept is somewhat lost in our day, but it is a concept that if we look back to these people, if we look back to the Scottish Covenanters, if we look back to King Benjamin, we'll notice that, you know what? Both of them were able to unify a people. They were able to spark a movement without the sword, without bloodshed, without warfare, without having lots of wealth or popularity or social media marketing campaigns or all of the programs and things that we think today we need to convert people. Instead, they rallied entire nations together to stand for God, to change history forever by coming together and making covenants. And again, I ask the question, if it had so much power in the days of the Scottish Covenanters, before the gospel was even had on the earth, before the priesthood or anything was restored, and if it had so much power in King Benjamin's day, what would be the power if we brought this way of thinking back today? What would be the power if we came together as a people again to covenant before God for the defense of our liberties, for the reformation of our society, of our culture, of our standards, and ultimately loyalty to Jesus Christ as the King? I want to close here with why the Scottish Covenanters matter to me. I am the direct descendant of one of those martyrs. James Guthrie was my 10th great-grandfather, and I didn't even know about him until I was about 11 years old. It was actually a complete miracle that our family even found out. One of my family lines is a convert line, and we had done some of the ancestry back. And when I say we, I mean, my extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, had done some of the ancestry line back, but it had died at a certain point and we couldn't push it back and we couldn't figure out how. And my dad was actually working on the 4-a-day project. Ironically, this kind of comes full circle for me in a sense, because he was actually working on the 4-a-day project, felt prompted like he needed to study the Scottish Covenanters. He's reading this book on the Scottish Covenanters and comes across this man named James Guthrie. And he had this impression, that's your ancestor. Start with him and go down and you're going to be able to connect this ancestral line that you guys have been stumped about for years. Lo and behold, within a few days, he had punched the line through. And I'll never forget that time because we started studying these stories as a family, and something happened in my heart as I began connecting with these fathers and these ancestors of mine who had sacrificed so much for covenants. So James Guthrie was the son of a wealthy lord. He came from an ancient and very noble family. He was educated. He was very talented. And he was heading into the path of becoming a minister in just the main state-run church. But he had a change of heart. I mean, he became converted to really the movement of Reformation that was going on in Scotland. And he was only 26 years old when he was actually chosen as a representative to go to Edinburgh, Scotland, and sign the National Covenant, that National Covenant in 1638 in Edinburgh, Scotland at Greyfriars Kirk. So he's just a 26-year-old young man. He's heading to Scotland, and he gets to Edinburgh, and he's walking down the street, and he's getting ready to head into Greyfriars Kirk, where he's about to sign this National Covenant. And he almost runs right into none other than the city executioner. of all the people that you could run into that day, and the city executioner just happened to be in like all dressed up in his full garb. And that stunned the young man for a second. It was kind of this reality check for him a little bit, to remember, you're getting ready to head into this church. Are you sure you want to do this? This is not a game, and you could lose your life because of what you're about to do. And in fact, he actually had a premonition that the day would come when he was going to die. And as he laid down his pen from signing that day, signing the national covenant, he turned to someone there and he said, "I know that I shall die for what I have done this day, but I cannot die in a better cause." Even though James Guthrie was someone who was very passionate about his beliefs and also very uncompromising and sometimes a little stubborn, Oliver Cromwell called him the short man who could not bow. He also had a talent and a gift for being very peaceful and calming in debate. He didn't like fighting. He didn't like contention. He believed in peaceful reformation. And when people would get into heated arguments and be yelling at each other, he would stay very steady and he'd stay calm and he'd be like, let's just logically walk through this. But he was uncompromising. And so he was one of the first that was targeted when pressure began being put on the Scottish Covenanter movement and they began arresting and executing people. James Guthrie was one of the first men that were targeted, arrested, and put to death. The problem was James Guthrie had, in addition to some other pamphlets, written a book also called The Causes of the Lord's Wrath Against Scotland. And in this pamphlet, he was very direct. And he said Scotland is going to be under judgment from God, not just because, we have this wicked king and we need freedom and we need to change the laws. But he said, we have too much profanity in our nation. Our standards are way low. We are not living the way that we should as a people, in our culture, as a society. We are not exhibiting the true fruits of refinement and nobility. He said that fathers were not taking leadership in their home, that the people loved the world too much. He said we need to clean up the culture. We need to take God serious and stop playing games and playing around. And he said because of these problems in our nation, God has wrath. These are the causes of the Lord's wrath against Scotland. So he was very direct. Again, this wasn't just a political movement or a spiritual movement to these men, but they believed strongly in living high standards, in living good, clean lives. But the problem is that made a lot of people angry. So he was targeted, he was arrested, he was imprisoned. And he's in his trial, but he was so good at law that even the attorneys that were representing him were kind of like, you should just represent yourself because you're better than us. Unfortunately, though, these leaders wanted him dead. So no matter what he said, the sentence and the verdict was going to turn out the same. So he was sentenced to death by hanging. This was in June of 1661. He was only about 49 years old and had a very young family. So shortly before he died, they allowed his wife to bring his 2 little children in to visit him one last time before he was executed. He had a 5-year-old little boy named Willie, and then a younger little girl named Sophia. And as Willie runs in there, again, he's just this little 5-year-old boy, and James Guthrie knows his boy will probably forget his dad. He's just a young boy. Will he remember his dad? Will he remember what his dad stood for? His dad is leaving him. Is he going to survive? How is his family going to make it? And so he picks little Willie up and he puts him on his knee and he tells him, he says, Willie, the day will come when they will cast up to you that your father was hanged. In other words, they're going to taunt you about this. And they're going to be like, your dad was the criminal. Your dad was the lowlife. Your dad was the one who was sentenced to death. Your dad was not a great man. But he said, be not thou ashamed, lad. It is in a good cause. He wanted his little boy to remember that even though his dad was leaving, that he loved him so much. But this cause was worth dying for. The covenants of Scotland and the covenants they were making with God were worth everything. The day that James Guthrie was hung in Edinburgh, Scotland, he was taken to the scaffold where he stood up And he gave a 1-hour speech. It was a speech that he also had written down, and he gave it to someone. He said, I want you to give this to my son, so that he would know that what his dad stood for, what his dad died for. And then, as he was about to die, he lifted the handkerchief off of his head, and his last words were, the covenants, they shall yet be Scotland's reviving. His head was cut off, it was hung on the Netherbow port, and it's reported that day after day, his little boy Willie would disappear, and they would find out that he would run to the gate, and he would look up at his dad's head sitting there on the gate, and all he could say afterwards were, I've seen my father's head, I've seen my father's head. Willie's mother and his little sister were exiled. They were driven out of the country. And for a long time, people thought that Willie had either died young, probably died childless. And it's only more recently that we've discovered that he actually did have children. And those children did survive, probably more in secret because of the danger of the times. But I myself and my family and many, many others are descendants of that little boy, Willie. That boy who saw his father give his life for these covenants and for what they embodied and for the hope that they held, not just for Scotland, but for the people of Israel around the world. The Guthrie motto has long been Sto pro veritate, which means I stand firmly in the forefront for truth, which our family has kind of adopted as our own. But as I was pondering in preparing for this lesson on the Scottish Covenanters and about King Benjamin and noticing the parallels as King Benjamin establishes peace and prepares his people for liberty without bloodshed or war again, I thought over and over about all of the conflict that we face as a people today. We face so many problems, and too often I think we resort to thinking that the solution is more bloodshed, more war. And while it cannot be denied that our liberties are bought with blood and that we will need to defend them with blood, the only real solution that is going to turn our country and our world around is exactly what James Guthrie got up and prophesied about as his last words before giving his life for that very cause. The covenants, the covenants. And I want to just emphasize that again, that today we can say the same. It is the covenants that will yet be Israel's reviving. It is the covenants that will yet be the reviving of Zion and of the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ throughout the world. The covenants of God are the solution, and this is why the Book of Mormon matters, because the Book of Mormon is that new covenant. It is the message that God is sending to us in our day to help us remember what these covenants are and return to making those covenants with God. And with my ancestor James Guthrie and so many forefathers before us, I want to add my testimony that I know that these covenants will be our reviving.